Meta AI is the personal AI that's tailored to you, now with its very own app. It's built to get to know you, offering helpful answers and inspiration. Looking for something to add to your bucket list? Meta AI goes beyond traveling the world. It remembers you're a basketball fanatic and suggests you attend one of the playoff games. Just start typing or speaking to get the answers you need, wherever and whenever, because Meta AI is your personal AI. Download the Meta AI app, now available on the Apple App Store and Google Play.
Your weekend is not complete without the First Lady of New York Radio. It's the Joan Hamburg Show. Talk Radio 77 WABC.
All right, everyone. It's Joan Hamburg, and I read a fascinating book by Clara Bingham, who's a journalist, the author of other books, of articles, magazines. I know you know her and you know her work. This is a fascinating look. It's called The Movement, and it's how women's liberation transformed America from 1963 to 1973. And this book brought many different memories back to me, because during my youth, I was working as a writer at a major advertising agency, and we worked in a big bullpen, and sitting next to me was Betty Friedan's husband, who would regale me with stories of his wife. On one hand, he admired her. I mean, he would talk about her no end. And on the other hand, you sort of felt, even I felt as a kid, that he resented her, and everything that she was doing, but had a lot of adventures. And Clara's book brings a lot of it back. What happened in those years? What happened to our country and to everything? But I'm just curious, what made you decide at this point in time to do this?
Thank you, Joan, for having me on the show. And I love hearing that story. I can't wait to dig down more on Betty Friedan's husband. But the reason why I did this book at this time is after the Me Too moment in 2017, right, when thousands and thousands of women came clean about the sexual harassment they were experiencing at work, I realized that this was a really important time to revisit the second wave feminist movement and look at where it all started when women first got into the workplace in jobs beyond being secretaries and file clerks and nurses and teachers. And I also realized that the women that I interviewed were, in between the ages of 77 and 97, and that this was a very good time to catch them and ask them to reflect on the impact that they had on women today. So it also, the book is a sequel, in a sort of sequel of my last book, which was called Witness to the Revolution. Right. And that too was an oral history of the school year 69-70. And it had one chapter on the feminist movement, the women's liberation movement. And when I wrote that chapter, that book came out in 2016, I realized this must be my next book, because it was the most lasting movement for social change that took place in the 60s and that impacted the most people, 50% of the population. So I also felt that the second wave has gotten kind of a bad rap historically. And there's still a lot of young women, especially, who don't think feminism is a dirty word, who associate the second wave with just a bunch of middle-class white women, and that it wasn't intersectional at all. It didn't have any other elements that were important. And so I kind of was curious. I was born in 1963. So I benefited from so many of the changes that took place during that 10-year period that the book covers. But I saw myself as a generational outsider looking in to try to get a feel for what it was like for the women who were on the ground making the change, the second wave warriors, as I call them. And I felt that their stories are more relevant now really than ever.
Did all this work and what you've done, Clara, change your head when it comes to women and equality? Did you get a sense that women had real equality or thought they did, or they have a long way to go?
Well, I mean, the women today versus women in 1963 are experiencing an entirely different world and an entirely different level of equality. We have come a very long way. And even though we've had a massive backslide when it comes to reproductive rights, we also have a woman of color running for president, and who's the first nominee for the Democratic Party ever to do that, and who has a good chance of possibly winning.
Right.
And, we have 151 women in Congress, the largest number ever. And, women are in every level of government and every industry. They make up more than 50% of law school and medical students, whereas back in 1963, they made up about 3% of law school and medical students. So understanding how far we've come I think is a hopeful way of looking at where we have to go, because it isn't. I feel like so many people think, oh no, it's over. We lost Roe v. Wade. Women have no chance. It's all going back. Millions of young women are scrolling on TikTok, obsessing over trad wives. I don't know if you know about that new movement, Joan, but it's pretty fascinating and I think a bit depressing. But the pendulum is always moving, and it never moves in one direction. So we have had a backslide, but it's really important to understand how far we've come.
And do you find that the younger women in your conversations feel that there is gender equality, or the fight is about to even get worse?
Well, I think certainly in terms of reproductive rights in the banned states, and now there are almost 20 of them, a third of women in America of childbearing age live in banned states right now. So we're living under what I call a Jane Crow system. Jim Crow was, of course, what happened during segregation in the South, where Black people lived under completely different laws than white people and were, experienced segregation. This is Jane Crow. So women who live in those states need to organize and get politicized and realize that they are living in a completely backward, world. And it's really, really tough. I think women who aren't in, and I can't speak for everyone, of course, and I haven't been all over the country polling these people. So I really am just guessing, essentially. But women who are younger and in non-banned states are, of course, have a lot of opportunities. And what I see as one of the big problems for them is childcare. And, we still are the last Western nation to not have paid family leave. And we have no national childcare at all. And in fact, in 1971, a major childcare bill was passed by both houses of Congress, and Nixon vetoed it. And it was one of the great feats for the second wave feminist movement, because there has never been a child care bill that has come close to passing ever since 1971. So, women will always have the issue of being mothers and, giving birth to babies. And that it comes with, of course, all sorts of responsibilities. And until either men are sharing them 50% or partners are sharing that childcare 50%, it will always be a deficit, at least professionally, for young women. And that this is really, I think, a huge issue that needs to be addressed in the future.
Right. I'm talking to Clara Bingham. We're talking about her new book, The Movement, How Women's Liberation Transformed America from 1963 to 1973. Did you have an easy time determining whom to interview?
No, I interviewed about 120 women, and I could have kept on going. You know, it was one of those. I worked on this book for almost 5 years, and it was so fascinating. And each interview, you know, one led to the other and led to the next, and it was very hard to stop the research process. And I decided to tackle the story chronologically, and I decided what my topics were, and then would, you know, search out the women, many of whom I had never heard of before, and I'm sure most of my readers won't have, who were on the ground, on the sidewalk, in the room, making change, protesting, meeting, organizing. And I wanted to give the reader a visceral, emotional, authentic sense of what it was like to be there then on the front lines of change. And so that's why it's an oral history narrative, because I don't appear except in footnotes and introductions to chapters. And you're hearing directly from these women. And I had long, intimate, fascinating interviews with so many of them. I interviewed athletes, who the first woman to run the Boston Marathon in 1966, Billie Jean King and her group of the original 9 of tennis players who started their own Virginia Slims tennis league. And I interviewed feminist artists who worked with Judy Chicago and Faith Ringgold, and amazing feminist artists who protested early on because their art wasn't shown in galleries or museums. So I interviewed the founders of Our Bodies, Ourselves, the iconic women's health book, which came out in 1970 and has sold millions and millions of copies ever since. So what I wanted to show in this book is this movement was not just about politics and law. It was cultural. It took place in the boardroom. It took place in the bedroom and on the factory floor. It affected women who were blue collar women, white collar women, and everyone of every race. And it was very much led by women of color who had cut their chops in the civil rights movement. And it was very intricately, importantly linked to the civil rights movement in the earlier 60s. So women like Polly Murray, Eleanor Holmes Norton, Barbara Smith, there were so many. Florence Kennedy, who you may have known in New York. Did you know her?
Yes,
by any chance?
I did. Not well, but I knew her. I mean, we would go to all those meetings during the time, and the cast of characters whom you brought right back by reading and writing about them, Clara. But, you know, they were all so different. You had Betty Friedan, who was tough and gritty and sort of angry and hard to love. And then you had all the glamour with Gloria Steinem. And, you know, I remember how many women we'd go to our consciousness raising groups, which we had then. And they wanted to be like Gloria. You know, she seemed to have it all during those years. And you paint amazing pictures of all these women who really fought and worked so hard to achieve what was their due, you know, just the rights. And it was quite an adventure. And the question is, is it still? Is it optimistic? Did the women you talk to, as well as those from 63 to 73, do they feel that every woman is well on her way now, or is the battle still there?
Oh, the battle is still there, certainly. I mean, we've come a long way, but my theory is, and I've, over the years dug into this, that misogyny is a very powerful force, and it's primal, and it is unconscious in a lot of cases, and it is really the big hurdle that every woman is up against. And I mean, you see it with Kamala Harris, who is one of the most qualified people to ever run for the presidency. And, she's still being accused of not being qualified, right, or being stupid. It was interesting, Shirley Chisholm, who was another important person in this book, who ran for president in 1972, first Black woman to do so. She was the first Black woman elected to Congress in 1968. And she suffered so much sexism and racism when she was first in Congress. And she always said that she found that sexism was harder to overcome than racism. Coming from her, that's a pretty authentic thing to know. And it just means that women are always going to be fighting, for first class citizenship and to be taken seriously and for equality. And it's an ongoing battle. But I feel like you can't move forward without understanding whose shoulders you stand on. And that's why, in a way, this book is a blueprint for the future. That we must know our past in order to move forward. And, past is prologue, as they say. But that's why I also felt like it's an important moment right now, because we are in a very critical moment in terms of women's rights, having lost Roe v. Wade. And so the women need to gear up politically in a way they haven't had to do for decades. And so while they're doing that, which they're doing right now in amazing ways, it's a good time to understand what came before them and how women broke the original glass ceiling.
Yeah, and not easy at all.
No. Did you know Shirley Chisholm, Joan?
Not personally as a friend, but of course, they were all major players during a very complicated time. And she was such a presence, as many of them were. But it's really interesting. I found a letter in my files from my boss, where I had just taken time off to have a baby, and saying, please ask your husband for permission to come back to work.
Oh my gosh.
My kids couldn't believe it. And there was so many things like that. And I probably at the time didn't think there was anything wrong with it.
No, of course not.
Of course I'll ask my husband.
What did he say, Joan? Did you get a yes or a no?
The thing with my poor husband was it didn't matter what he said, because I was going to do what I wanted anyway. But, I'm sure he was very liberating, and encouraged it. But, the rules were the rules. And
right.
Someone was going to stay home. I still remember so many years ago, the mornings when someone was sick, one of the kids, and someone had to stay home. And we would argue gently over who was going to be the one. And a lot of women today, till they read your book, don't know how liberation transformed our lives in many positive ways and how complicated it was.
Yeah, and it definitely had a huge impact on marriages.
Without question.
I interviewed Alex Kate Schulman, who you might have known, and she wrote a famous essay called A Marriage Agreement, which made lots of, made people very uncomfortable. It was written in 1970, and it was literally a description of a contract that she made with her husband. They had 2 children, and she realized she was doing all the childcare, all the cleaning, all the housework, and that he, did nothing. And meanwhile, she also worked. She was a writer and an activist. And so she literally wrote down a breakdown of the schedule. Children, and it's there. I'm looking at it right now. Very funny. And then it was serious. Nighttime, who's doing what, housework, who does what, and it talked about how this agreement, which she agreed to, changed their lives, and that they both were able to, make the juggle of having children and a marriage and careers with a new level of equality, and that was, at the time in 1970, almost unheard of, wasn't it, Joan?
Yes, absolutely.
And that's something that's hard to understand now, how it was just, men just did not lift a finger at home.
Well, and they weren't expected to. I mean, that was the issue in many ways. We often talked about how things might have been different, but the expectation from us, the women, was, it's okay, honey, let us do this and that, and don't worry, I'll feed the kids. And, I can't tell you how many lamb chops I consumed during those years, because I was in such a hurry to give them dinner so I could do my thing, and I would end up eating their dinner.
Well, at least it wasn't hot dogs.
No, it wasn't. It was plenty of times, but lamb chops were the big item. Today, I don't think my kids even know what lamb chops are, many of them. That was a real mommy's meal then.
I love it. I of course, my mother fed me chunky soup.
Yeah, of course.
Right out of the can.
Yeah. I know they like that. We did a lot of crazy things, and I remember my kids would often say, my daughter still remembers it. I'd say, "What do you want for dinner?" Always, rushing to put it on the table and doing whatever, and she would say, "I'd like ice cream," and I had the audacity to say, "Okay, vanilla or chocolate." And I thought, what was wrong with that? That was a healthy meal. And we were nuts, but we did what we had to do. And
exactly.
And weren't even aware that liberation was part of our DNA, and that we were part of the group that was changing the face of America and how America viewed women in many ways.
So that's so interesting to me, that you and your, contemporaries were really, for the first time in human history, in human recorded history, were changing the status of women from second class to first class.
We didn't know it, though.
No one had ever done this before. They tried, the suffragettes tried,
right.
But they got the vote. It took them 80 years to get the vote. They got the vote in 1920, and then they stopped. And no laws changed, and nothing really changed for women, except for that they could vote. But they were discriminated against in education and professionally and in every part of society. They weren't allowed to, be athletes. They weren't allowed to go to many colleges, many graduate schools. They certainly were not allowed to work in most jobs. And that was the case until 1970.
Right.
When you were feeding your kids lamb chops.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what I find so profound about this moment, that so many women like you were just living through the change And now, 50 years later, we can look back and realize what a massive change that was.
Right, but we didn't know, and we didn't have a roadmap.
Of course not.
No one really ahead of us that we looked to and said, well, this is what's happening and this is how we have to act. We just, whatever happened, we sort of accepted and grabbed
You were
it.
absolute, real pioneers. You're true pioneers.
Without our knowing it.
I just think it's just so fascinating. And of course, rejecting everything that you had grown up with and that your mothers had done.
Right. But I had an unusual mother who said, don't give it up. You can do anything, be anything. You can't have it all, but you can make it work. It just isn't going to be perfect. And she was very unusual. And I also went to a women's college, Barnet, where the dean would once a week at the little town meetings we had give us the same message. Don't give up. Be something. Do something. Make your voice heard. And we were a small class then, and we believed it, and we went for it.
Amazing.
So it was a very different time, but we had no real expectations.
Right. In a way, maybe it's easy. It might have been better that you were able to just kind of, in a way, blindly move forward without understanding the significance of what you were doing. It took some of the pressure off.
Yeah, I think it did, because we just went ahead, and did what we had to do. And I remember rushing home to pay my babysitter, who had to rush home to pay her babysitter. And, years later, when we met again, we just said, how did we do that? We just laughed, but we just forged ahead.
I love it. Did you face much job discrimination earlier in your career?
Well, it was a double-edged sword. On one hand, companies were being encouraged to hire women, for the first time in a long time. On the other hand, our male counterparts, we found out, were making so much more than us and had so many more opportunities. So a mixed blessing.
Right. And what were some of your first jobs?
I wrote copy for a magazine called Coupon Magazine. And, it was, you can have your ad in our magazine in 4-color with editorial usage of it. And I'll never forget, I have the worst handwriting. I was a lefty turned righty. And no one could ever read my handwriting. And obviously, those in power who were employing me couldn't read it either. And I invited the head, I think it was General Mills, instead of having his ads in our magazine in 4-color with editorial usage, I invited him to have his ass in our magazine. I spelled it wrong in 4-color, and I got fired immediately.
Oh, no.
For causing this grievous insult and injury to such an important guy.
Oh, my gosh, that's hilarious.
So
I'm sorry, that must have been shocking.
Yeah,
it must have been no fun to experience.
I know. We had a lot of adventures in those days, and there was no one to tell us right or wrong, but we just did it. And, it worked by the end of it.
It did, and how much do you attribute some of that to your consciousness raising groups?
Some of the consciousness raising was really important because it empowered us. And on the other hand, some of the messages were angry and not valid, like, don't take that from your husband, leave. And a lot of women did just that, and it wasn't always the right thing, the right choice. So, it's when I read The Movement, your new book, it really brought back all these memories and made me understand what a time we went through and how life-changing and transforming these years were and our adventures were, because we didn't have our so-called sisters ahead of us doing that. We weren't, sort of involved in that.
Right. And it must have broken up a lot of marriages.
It did.
Didn't it sound? Yeah.
It did. And it was, and a lot of the women in retrospect regretted, sort of pounding on the drum and thinking, all right, I can do this, and not try to resolve it. So there was good and bad in all of it.
Yeah. I mean, there were fringe parts of the movement that were legitimately man-hating, that were anti-nuclear family, and that part of the movement was easy to exploit by people like Phyllis Schlafly.
Right.
And that was also something. Betty Friedan was quite backward when it came to gay rights, but the reason why she didn't accept lesbians in the earlier years was because she wanted to appeal to the mainstream. She wanted to appeal to women in the Midwest and all over the country, and make the movement a mass movement. And she realized that if it was considered just a lesbian movement, or a movement where everyone hated men and wanted to leave their husbands and not have children, and that just wasn't going to fly politically. And so that, with all movements, everyone's reacting to something.
Right.
And in the moment, and you can understand why in the moment. But I think a lot of people who were on that more, lefty fringe, probably, and some of them I interviewed, regret how far they went, and then often, moved back to the center later in their lives.
Imagine this: the best pasta sauce you have ever tasted sits abandoned on a plate. Wasted sauce. That is a tragedy. If only you had used Barilla al Bronzo pasta. Its bronze-cut texture holds your sauce and scoops up every last drop. The Italians call that scarpetta. Capture sauce the Italian way. Barilla al Bronzo. Click or tap the banner to find out more.
Yeah, and a lot of things we did, Clara, we really didn't have the map or anything. We just sort of went blindly out there and try to make it work. And some things were good and some things weren't. Sometimes the support that we had was well-intentioned, but it wasn't really thought out. We just forged forward. And I remember the disparity in a lot of things that went on. You didn't know what you should be doing and whom should you listen to. And Betty Friedan was a really big voice, but it was hard, as I said, to love her.
Why was that? What was it about Betty?
Because I don't think she liked women that much.
Yeah, that's what I heard.
And you sort of wanted to be under this umbrella. And women still need to be loved and liked. And especially my generation, that's what we were brought up to be. And if you were made to feel like that, then they had you on their side. But if you felt like, all right, I got to talk to you, or you've got to get involved in this, and that you were sort of pushed in through the back door, you again had different feelings. But it was all a great adventure, and many of us got through it and had life-changing worlds because of the woman's movement, and which is what we called it in '63. So looking back, I don't regret any of it. It was the push that many of us needed, but we maybe a better roadmap in those years, but we got through.
You got through all right. Now I was thinking one of the chapters, there were a few chapters in the book are about the women who worked at Newsweek magazine.
Yeah.
In 1970, they became the first class action right. For gender discrimination in the workplace, and 46 of them organized quite secretly and hired Eleanor Holmes Norton, who at the time was at the ACLU, and she was a civil rights lawyer, and she was able, they announced their lawsuit against the magazine, which the reason why they did this was and the reason why Eleanor Holmes Norton loved this case was if you looked at the masthead of Newsweek, all of the top jobs went to men, and then there was a line essentially, and then all the bottom jobs went to women. So, and for example, Nora Ephron, the great late Nora Ephron, applied for a job there and straight out of Wellesley, and where she was editor of her, student paper. And they asked her, "What do you want to do here?" And she said, "Well, I want to be a writer." And they laughed and said, "Well, women don't write in Newsweek." So women were just mail girls. They were fact checkers. They were secretaries, but they couldn't be writers or editors. And so they eventually realized this has got to be illegal. And Eleanor Holmes Norton was able to really fight for them, and they opened up the workplace in so many ways for millions and millions of women with this first lawsuit. And then an amazing little postscript to that is I went to work at Newsweek after college, a few years after college in the late 80s. And I worked as a correspondent in the Washington Bureau. I covered the White House. I had a, wonderful time there. And I was completely oblivious about this, class action lawsuit that had taken place. And then I interviewed Lucy Howard and Lynn Povich for my book, and realized that I had been filing stories weekly to Lucy Howard, who was one of the women in the class action. And I had no idea about any of this until I wrote the book. So it's an example of how what you did in your generation did, opened up so many doors for the rest of us. And that's why I think it's really important to remember. Yes. Yeah. I don't think Lucy Howard was thinking, well, this is going to be great for, women who graduate from college in the 80s. They'll get to just prance right in.
Yeah, and what you ended up doing, those were the jobs that we all wanted. Oh, if you got a job at Time magazine, you were in heaven, even if you did nothing but open mail, which is what you did.
Because it was certainly better than just being a secretary.
Of course. Right? Of course.
Yeah.
And you had to take, when I got out of Barnard College, I remember one of the career advisors, which I doubt would happen today, said, how's your shorthand? I said, oh, I don't know shorthand. Why? She said, well, you're not going to get a job without shorthand or speed writing. And it was true. We came out of school, and Barnard was a challenging school, and we couldn't do anything unless we had really good skills in speed writing and shorthand and all of that. And
typing, right?
Oh, you had to
were you always judged by how many words you could type?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You had to really be a good typist. And it was, but we didn't challenge it. We accepted it. And I used to memorize, your test for getting a job was they dictate something, and then you would have to prescribe it. But because
Right.
my handwriting was so horrible, I learned to memorize the dictation. You know, they would
Wow.
dictate, I would memorize it, so they would never know that, forget if you were hiring a shorthand person or something, this wasn't her. But I got away with it because I had a good memory. And we all came up with our different ways.
Right, your fixes. Now, and of course, men didn't take shorthand, did they? Or did they even know how to type?
You mean what, today?
No, then.
No, of course you didn't know. You know, we didn't really have computers or anything. So many of us did what I did, memorize the the dictations, and just got through with it. But we did.
One of the other good jobs back then that were considered good jobs was to be an airline stewardess.
Oh yeah, people love doing that, but you had to look so good all the time.
And so they would weigh everyone in every day. So there were weight limits, and you were fired once you hit 32.
Right.
And also fired if you got engaged, or God forbid, if you got pregnant.
Right.
And of course, this worked out really well for the airlines because they never had to pay pensions or keep anyone, employed for very long. And so and there was even a flight, I wonder if you remember this, Joan, called the Executive. And it was a United flight that would go from Chicago to New York multiple times a day, back and forth. And only men were allowed to be passengers. And this was the case from 1950 to 1973. So that basically airline stewardesses were sex symbols, and they were a way of, they had poochy, amazing short skirts and all different kinds of
they look really
seductive
good.
outfits. Yeah, right. And they were a great way for the, airlines to basically sell sex and get men on these flights. And maybe they would get a wife. If they did, there were all sorts of ads like that. And the airline stewardesses were some of the first people to file sex discrimination complaints at the newly formed EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and that opened in 1965. And, the airline union, the women were organized, they were part of the union, and it was so clear to them that they were being exploited. And of course, United was all of these airlines were able to get hundreds and hundreds of women to apply for their jobs. They were very hard to get because it was a glamorous, fun job.
Right. And I remember thinking I should try for one of those jobs, see the world. It was very enticing.
No, exactly. And they were involved in long battles with multiple different airlines over, a decade or two, starting in the late 60s, trying to equalize the employment situation. And so every time I take a flight now and I see male stewards and flight attendants, as we call them now, of every age and race and gender, it's just such a relief to see the change.
Exactly. Well, you've seen a lot, and I urge everyone, read the book, The Movement. It's, in a way, it changes your whole head and how you think. And the subtitle, How Women's Liberation Transformed America 1963 to 1973. And what better time than now with all that's going on. So your timing was perfect, Clara.
I didn't plan on it, but I'm very, I'm happy that this is a history that is now really relevant.
Exactly. Happening every minute. Thank you so much. I look forward to talking to you again. And
thank you, Joan. I love hearing your stories, too.
We'll talk.
Thanks for having me.
A pleasure. Thank you. I'm Joan Hamburg. And you've been listening to Clara Bingham, The Movement. Read it. I'm Joan Hamburg.
Americans love using their credit cards, the most secure and hassle-free way to pay. But D.C. politicians want to change that with the Durbin-Marshall credit card bill. This bill lets corporate megastores pick how your credit card is processed, allowing them to use untested payment networks that jeopardize your data security and rewards. Corporate megastores will make more money, and you pay the price. Tell Congress to guard your card, because Americans lose when politicians choose. Learn more at guardyourcard.com.